She stood at the gates of the most powerful building in the city, not as a servant, not as a beggar, but as the woman who owned it. The man who threw her out with nothing but a garbage bag and a growing belly was about to learn that God keeps receipts. And today, the bill had come due. Hello friends, welcome to Stories by Jason. Before we start, please do not forget to support our channel by subscribing, liking, and sharing with your loved ones. Also, please let us know in the comments where you're watching from. The Callaway estate sat on 42 acres of manicured silence in Buckhead, Atlanta's most gilded zip code. It was the kind of property that made people slow their cars and stare, wrought iron gates that rose 12 feet into the Georgia sky, a fountain that ran year-round even in drought, and a main house with 27 rooms that were mostly empty, tended daily by a staff of 14 who moved through the halls like well-trained ghosts. Elena Vasquez had been one of those ghosts for 3 years. She had come to Atlanta at 22 from a small town outside Oaxaca, Mexico, following her Aunt Rosa, who had worked for the Callaway family for over a decade. Rosa had cleaned those marble floors on hands and knees until her knuckles cracked and bled. She had ironed Richard Callaway's shirts with a precision that bordered on religion. And when Rosa's vision began to fail her, and she could no longer thread a needle or read the fine print on cleaning product labels, it was Elena who stepped in quietly, without complaint, slipping into her aunt's role like a hand into a familiar glove. Elena was not naive. She knew exactly what she was: staff, furniture that moved, a body that occupied space only long enough to make that space more comfortable for the man who owned it all. She had no illusions about the hierarchy of the Callaway household, where the distance between employer and employee was not merely financial but atmospheric, a difference in the very air they were understood to breathe. She cleaned, she cooked when the chef was away, she ironed, she folded, she disappeared. And then, against every rule she had constructed for her own survival, she made one catastrophic mistake. It began the way these things always do, not with fireworks or declarations, but with proximity and loneliness. Richard Callaway was 41, recently divorced from his second wife, Caroline, who had taken her settlement and her contempt to a beach house in the Hamptons. The estate felt enormous and hollow in the months after the divorce. Richard had taken to staying up late in his study, drinking bourbon and reading acquisition reports, and Elena, whose shift sometimes stretched past midnight, would bring him his second drink and his third. And sometimes he would say something to her, not just an instruction but an actual sentence, a real question, and she would answer carefully from the doorway. Then one night he asked her to sit down. She should have said no. She knew at the moment the word yes left her mouth. But she was lonely too, in a way that the daylight hours kept hidden, the loneliness of invisibility, of being looked through for so long that you began to wonder if you were truly there. They talked, then they talked again. Then the talking became something else entirely, something Elena's conscience screamed at her about in the dark hours while it was happening and for weeks afterward. She told herself it meant something to him. She told herself his gentleness was real. She was 25 years old and she had been unseen for so long that when a powerful man finally looked at her, truly looked, she mistook attention for affection and proximity for love. She found out she was pregnant on a Tuesday in March. She told him on a Wednesday. By Thursday she was gone. She would replay that Thursday for years afterward, the way Richard's face changed when she told him, that almost imperceptible rearrangement of his features from surprise to calculation to something cold and managerial. He didn't raise his voice. He never raised his voice. That was what made it so devastating, the absolute stillness of him, the way he handled the situation, the way he handled a bad quarterly report, with efficiency and without sentiment. He called his estate manager, Douglas, into the study. He said, in a level voice, that Elena's employment was being terminated effective immediately. He said there would be a severance. Douglas produced an envelope. It had been prepared with a speed that told Elena this was not the first time this had happened in this house, in this study, with this man, and placed it on the desk between them. $3,000, and a non-disclosure agreement, printed in English, which was not Elena's first language, which Richard Callaway knew perfectly well. "Sign this," Douglas said, not unkindly, "and the money is yours. Don't sign it and we'll need to have a different kind of conversation." Elena looked at Richard. He was already looking at his acquisition report. She signed. She took the envelope. She walked through the kitchen one last time, past the gleaming appliances she had wiped down that morning, past the pantry she had reorganized just last week, and out through the service entrance, not the front door, never the front door into the blue-gray Atlanta morning. She stood on the sidewalk outside the estate's back gate with a duffel bag containing everything she owned in America, $3,000 in an envelope, and a life growing inside her that Richard Calloway had already decided did not exist. She was 25 years old. She had nowhere to go. Her Aunt Rosa, who might have been her refuge, had returned to Mexico 8 months prior when her own health made working impossible. Alina had no family in Atlanta, no close friends. The Calloway household had been her entire world, and now the gates had closed behind her with a sound like a period at the end of a sentence. She sat on a bus stop bench 3 blocks from the estate and opened the envelope. $3,000. She stared at it for a long time. She thought about the non-disclosure agreement she had signed, the words she had not fully understood, the binding silence she had agreed to in exchange for this small stack of bills. Then she did something that she would later recognize as the first decision of her new life. She put the money back in the envelope. She folded the envelope carefully. She placed it in the innermost pocket of her duffel bag and zipped it closed. And she whispered something to herself, just 3 words in Spanish, that no one on that empty Atlanta street could hear. Todavía no termina. It's not over yet. She didn't know in that moment how right she was. She didn't know about the sleepless months ahead, the shelters, the hunger, the nights she would press her palm against her growing belly and beg God for just one more day of strength. She didn't know about the woman she was going to become, or the empire she was going to build, or the morning, 8 years from then, when she would sit in a boardroom that used to belong to the man who had just closed his gates against her, and she would be the one holding the keys. She only knew 3 words. And for now, 3 words were enough. The Atlanta City mission on Pryor Street didn't ask questions. That was the first thing Alina appreciated about it, the intake coordinator, a broad-shouldered woman named Beverly who wore her gray locks pinned up and her reading glasses on a beaded chain, simply looked at Alina's belly, looked at her bag, and said, "We've got a room with 2 other women. Rules are posted on the door. Breakfast at 7. That was it. No judgment in Beverly's eyes. No pity, which would have been worse. Alina lived at the shelter for 4 months. She delivered Marco Antonio Vasquez at Grady Memorial Hospital on a Wednesday evening in August, in a room where the ceiling tile had a water stain shaped like a running horse. She held him for the first time and felt something happen inside her chest that she had no word for in any language. A rearrangement, tectonic and permanent, as though her entire internal geography had shifted to accommodate this small, furious, perfect person who had arrived screaming into the world with her dark eyes, and she noted with a complicated ache Richard Calloway's strong, square jaw. She named him Marco after her grandfather, a man who had built his own house with his own hands in Oaxaca, who had told her when she was 7 years old that the only things worth having were the things you built yourself. She thought about that a lot in the months after Marco was born. Beverly at the shelter turned out to be more than a roof and a bowl of oatmeal. She was 63 years old, a former paralegal who had survived her own unraveling 20 years prior. And she had an eye for women who were going to make something of the rubble they'd been handed. She saw it in Alina within the first week. Not resilience exactly, because resilience was passive, was merely surviving. What Beverly saw in Alina was architecture, the ability to look at wreckage and see structure. "You have a brain," Beverly told her one afternoon, 3 weeks after Marco arrived, watching Alina read a discarded copy of a real estate investment magazine she'd found in the shelter's common room with the focused intensity of someone studying for an exam. "Don't waste it cleaning other people's houses." "I don't have credentials," Alina said. "I don't have." "You have $3,000 and you have time and you have the internet," Beverly said. "That's how most empires start. The rest is just showing up." It was Beverly who introduced her to Clarence Webb. Clarence was 71, a retired real estate attorney who volunteered his time at the mission's weekly financial literacy workshop, which was sparsely attended, and ran out of a room that smelled like old carpet and burnt coffee. He was the kind of man who had watched Atlanta transform itself 4 times over in his lifetime, and understood, with the deep cellular knowledge of someone who had watched wealth accumulate and evaporate and accumulate again, exactly how property worked in a city that was always building itself. He saw Alina sit through his workshop 3 consecutive weeks without missing a single session, taking notes on the back of a shelter intake form because she had no notebook. And on the 4th week, he stayed after and asked her what she was looking at. She told him, clearly, specifically, without embellishment. She had identified 3 properties in the Vine City neighborhood that were listed as tax delinquent, that sat on lots with favorable zoning, that could be acquired cheaply and rehabbed for rental income. She had done the math in the margins of her borrowed reading material. The numbers were rough but structurally correct. Clarence was quiet for a long moment. "Where did you learn to think like this?" he asked. "I cleaned houses for rich people for 3 years," Alina said. "I paid attention." He laughed. It was the kind of laugh that meant something. Over the next 6 months, Clarence became her mentor, her teacher, her unofficial guardian angel. He walked her through Georgia's tax lien process. He explained the mechanics of hard money lending. He helped her understand the NDA she had signed, and his expression when he read it was careful and considered, and he said only, "Keep this. Keep it safe. Someday it may matter more than you think." Alina used Richard Calloway's $3,000 to purchase her first tax lien certificate on a Vine City property. She was up at 5 every morning. Marco slept in a second-hand crib that Beverly's church had donated. Alina studied during his naps, worked a part-time bookkeeping job at a Jamaican restaurant 3 nights a week, and read everything Clarence gave her with the same voracious, starving attention she'd applied to survival for the past year. The Vine City property came to her 18 months later when the tax redemption period expired. She sold it to a community developer for a profit of $11,000, which she immediately reinvested in 2 more liens. Then 4 more. Then she started a small LLC, Vasquez Property Solutions, registered with $1,200 in Clarence's guidance, operating out of a laptop on the kitchen table of the 2-bedroom apartment she now rented in East Point, where Marco slept in his own room for the first time in his life and kept a plastic dinosaur on every windowsill. She did not forget Richard Calloway. She did not think about him every day. That would have given him too much of the time she needed for other things. But she kept a clear-eyed awareness of his business, the way you keep an eye on weather. She followed Calloway Enterprises in the business press. She watched his acquisitions, his press releases, his board changes, his divorce proceedings from wife number 3. And she watched, with growing interest, the quiet signs that not everything in his empire was as solid as it appeared. Calloway Enterprises had overextended during the pandemic, taken on significant debt to acquire distressed commercial properties that had not recovered the way Richard's analysts had projected. There were 3 major developments stalled, 2 pending lawsuits from contractors, and a flagship hotel project in Midtown that had run 60% over budget and was now sitting half-finished, bleeding carrying costs every single month. Alina knew all of this. She knew it the way a chess player knows the board, not with emotion, but with clarity. By the time Marco was 5 years old, Vasquez Property Solutions had a portfolio worth $1.4 million in assets. By the time he was 7, she had brought in 2 partners, a structural engineer named Diana Park and a finance whiz named Tobias Green, and rebranded as Vasquez Capital Group, with offices in a small but real suite in a building in Midtown Atlanta. By the time Marco was 8, she was ready. She had been patient for 8 years. She had built every stone of this foundation by hand. She had not rushed, had not acted from rage, had not let bitterness make her reckless, because she understood. She had understood since that morning on the bus stop bench outside his estate that the only revenge worth having was the kind that was indistinguishable from success. And she was ready to succeed. The acquisition meeting was held on the 14th floor of a glass tower in the heart of Buckhead, in a conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the same Atlanta skyline. Both parties had been quietly fighting over for the better part of a decade. Alina wore a charcoal gray blazer, her dark hair pinned back, a single gold chain at her throat. She carried a leather folio and walked into that room with the contained energy of someone who had been waiting for this specific moment for 8 years and was not going to let anyone see how much it cost her to keep her face neutral. The deal on the table was the Midtown Meridian, the stalled, over-budget hotel development that had become Callaway Enterprises' most visible wound. It was the kind of project that made headlines for all the wrong reasons: missed deadlines, contractor disputes, zoning battles, a financing gap that had grown from $12 million to $41 million as the months dragged on. Richard Callaway had, by all public accounts, been trying to find a white knight investor to complete the project. What he had found instead, through a chain of intermediaries and shell companies that had been carefully engineered to obscure the identity of the principal party until the last possible moment, was Vasquez Capital Group. Was Elena Vasquez. He walked into the conference room at 11:02, 2 minutes late, still projecting the casual authority of a man who believed his time cost more than other people's. And Elena watched him from the head of the table, her expression perfectly composed as he registered the people in the room, swept the table with his eyes, and then arrived at her face. She saw it, the fraction of a second hesitation, the micro-expression of recognition, then confusion, then something that passed too quickly to name before the professional mask snapped back into place. He sat down across from her. "Ms. Vasquez," he said, and his voice was controlled, smooth, unreadable. "I wasn't aware you'd be heading this delegation personally." "I like to be present for significant transactions," Elena said. "Would you like to review the term sheet, or shall we start with the project overview?" It was a masterclass in composure from both of them for the first 40 minutes. His lawyers were sharp. Her lawyers, Clarence Webb, had recommended the best real estate litigation firm in Atlanta, and Elena had spent 3 years building a relationship with them, were sharper. The numbers were discussed, challenged, refined. Elena's team had done thorough due diligence. They knew the Meridian project down to its rebar specifications. And when Richard's CFO tried to soft-pedal the financing gap, Diana Park dismantled the projections line by line with the quiet precision of a surgeon. Richard Callaway watched Elena through all of it. She could feel his gaze the way you feel heat from a fire, not enough to burn, but impossible to ignore. During a break, he approached her at the window. "It's been a long time," he said quietly, so only she could hear. 8 years, Elena said. "You've done well." She looked at him for a moment. "Yes," she said, "I have." Something shifted in his face, not guilt exactly, but an awareness, perhaps for the first time, of the full weight of what he was looking at. Not a maid. Not a problem he had solved with an envelope. A woman who had built something, who stood across from him in a room she had engineered specifically to contain him. "Elena, we should get back to the term sheet," she said. But the meeting was only the beginning. Over the following 3 weeks, as the deal progressed through due diligence and negotiation, Elena's legal team, under Clarence's watchful eye, began a parallel process that Richard Callaway's people did not immediately understand was happening. A civil paternity action, filed quietly in Fulton County Superior Court. Documentation of Marco's birth, Elena's employment records from the Callaway estate, the NDA, which Elena's attorney argued had been signed under duress, and in a second language without proper legal counsel, and was therefore unenforceable, and 8 years of financial records showing the cost of raising a child entirely alone. The NDA unraveling was the linchpin. Clarence had seen it immediately. All those years ago, the document had been prepared hastily, had not met Georgia's requirements for a valid NDA in the context of employment termination, and the financial duress under which Elena had signed it made it doubly vulnerable. When Richard's legal team received the paternity filing, the response was swift and aggressive. Motions to suppress, motions to dismiss, a counterfiling claiming the NDA was valid and that Elena was in breach. But here was the thing about Elena Vasquez that Richard Callaway had fundamentally misunderstood when he handed her that envelope 8 years ago. She had been preparing for this specific legal fight for 6 years. She had studied it, anticipated it, built her case stone by patient stone. His lawyers were reacting. She had already won. The deposition was held on a Thursday. Richard arrived with 3 attorneys, and the practiced confidence of a man who had survived depositions before. Alina sat across from him and answered every question in measured, precise sentences, and when it was her team's turn, they produced documentation that Richard's legal team had not known existed. Messages recovered from a cell phone backup, hotel records, testimony from 2 former members of the Calloway estate staff who had witnessed the termination, witnessed Douglas producing that pre-prepared envelope, and who had, over the years, quietly agreed to speak. Richard's lead attorney called for a recess 4 times. On the 5th recess, they asked to discuss settlement. Alina's answer, delivered through her attorney, was 3 words: "We go forward." The Atlanta Journal-Constitution ran the story on a Monday, and by Tuesday it had been picked up by 17 national outlets. Real estate mogul Richard Calloway III faces paternity suit, fraud allegations in high-profile Atlanta case. The coverage was thorough and unsparing. The pregnancy, the NDA, the $3,000 envelope, the 8 years of silence, the woman who had built a $20 million real estate company from the wreckage of a Thursday morning exile. Journalists found the contrasts irresistible. The Buckhead estate with its 12-foot gates and year-round fountain, the Atlanta City Mission on Pryor Street, where a young woman with nowhere to go had found her footing. Alina did not speak to the press. Not once. She let the facts do the work that she had spent 8 years carefully, painstakingly constructing, and she trusted them the way she had always trusted her numbers, implicitly, completely, without the need for drama or embellishment. The court proceedings took 11 weeks in total. Richard Calloway's team fought for every inch, the way wealthy men's teams always do, because the money to fight is never a constraint and delay is always a form of winning. But Alina had anticipated this too. The Meridian acquisition had been structured so that Vasquez Capital Group held an earnest deposit that functioned as a performance bond, and as the legal proceedings dragged on and the development timeline slipped, the financial pressure on Calloway Enterprises intensified with each passing week. 2 of his institutional investors quietly withdrew. His board of directors, already skittish about the reputational exposure, demanded a special meeting. And while all of that was happening, something else entirely was unfolding in the kitchen of Alina's East Point apartment. She had known since Marco was old enough to understand simple stories that she would tell him the truth about his father, all of it, age-appropriately in pieces, as he was ready. She had not poisoned him. She had not performed bitterness in front of him, had not used him as a vessel for her own pain. Marco was 8 years old and he was extraordinary, quick, and curious, and tender-hearted in a way that sometimes made Alina's chest hurt with love for him. And he asked her one Saturday morning, over the dinosaur egg cereal he still insisted on, why their last name was different from some of his friends' families. She sat across from him at the kitchen table. "Because your dad and I made different choices," she said carefully, "and I made sure you and I were okay on our own." Marco chewed his cereal. He had Richard's jaw and Alina's eyes, and he looked at her with a steadiness that children sometimes have that puts adults to shame. "Is my dad a bad person?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment. "He made bad choices," she said finally. "That's different from being a bad person, though sometimes it's hard to tell where one ends and the other begins." Marco nodded slowly, with the gravity of someone filing information for future reference. "Are you still mad at him?" he asked. Alina considered this honestly. "I used to be," she said. "Now I mostly feel clear, like I can see everything without the fog of it." Marco considered this too. Then he went back to his cereal. The paternity test confirmed what everyone already knew. Richard Calloway III was Marco Antonio Vasquez's biological father, and under Georgia law, 8 years of unpaid child support, calculated at the rate applicable to his income level, constituted a significant sum. A very significant sum. His lawyers ultimately negotiated the final figure down from the initial calculation, but it remained substantial, and it was paid. But the money was not the point. Alina had sufficient money now. It had never been about the money. The point was the moment in courtroom 8B of the Fulton County Superior Court, when the judge read the findings into the record and Richard Calloway sat at the defendant's table in his $8,000 suit, and heard, publicly and officially and permanently, that he had gotten a young woman in his employ pregnant. that he had handed her $3,000 and a coercive non-disclosure agreement, and had her removed from his property through the service entrance. That he had never inquired about the child she carried, had never provided support, had never acknowledged what he had done, and that the court found this pattern of conduct to constitute willful abandonment and financial misconduct. Alina sat at the plaintiff's table and watched his face as the findings were read. She had imagined this moment many times over 8 years. In some of those imaginings it felt like triumph, like the moment a long-held breath is finally released. In others it felt like nothing, hollow, a meal that doesn't satisfy after years of hunger. The reality was neither. What she felt, watching Richard Calloway hear the truth of what he had done spoken aloud in a room full of witnesses, was something closer to completion. The closing of a circle. Not satisfaction exactly, because nothing could give her back those years, those nights, those mornings on the shelter floor studying by a reading lamp while Marco slept. But something that felt like the world briefly, imperfectly, doing what it was supposed to do. After the proceedings, in the marble corridor outside the courtroom, Richard Calloway appeared beside her before she reached the elevator. His team was behind him. So was hers. They all stopped at a respectful distance, creating a brief artificial privacy that neither party had requested. He looked older than he had 8 years ago. The litigation had stripped something from him. Not his wealth, not yet, though Calloway Enterprises would spend the next several years quietly restructuring. But something in his bearing, the iron certainty he had always moved through the world with, the absolute conviction that his money made him untouchable. "Alina," he said. She waited. He stopped, started again. "I don't expect you to forgive me." She studied him for a moment. "I know you don't," she said. "Forgiving you was never for you. I did that a long time ago. It was for Marco." Something moved through his face. Something she couldn't quite name and wasn't sure she needed to. Richard hesitated. "Can I ever meet him?" This was the moment. The one she had thought about and prayed about and turned over more times than she could count. The one she had discussed with Clarence, with Beverly, with Diana and Tobias, with a therapist she'd been seeing for 2 years, with the woman in her mirror on the mornings she didn't know what the right answer was. "That's not my decision to make," Alina said. "That's Marco's. When he's old enough to choose it for himself, if he wants to know you, I won't stand in the way. I won't poison that for him. He deserves to make that choice with clear eyes." She paused. "But he has my number and so will you. And I need you to understand something, Richard." He was listening. "Whatever relationship you build with him, if you build one, you earn it, piece by piece. The way I built everything I have. You don't get to buy it and you don't get to charm your way into it. He's a remarkable child. He did not become remarkable because of you. He became remarkable in spite of you. You should know that." She pressed the elevator button. "Goodbye, Richard." The doors opened. She walked in, and Tobias and Diana followed, and the doors closed, and in the mirrored wall of the elevator Alina saw her own reflection. The charcoal blazer, the gold chain, the woman she had built from the bones of the girl who had sat on a bus stop bench with an envelope of blood money and 3 words of Spanish, and exactly nothing else. She smiled at herself. Not triumphant, not bitter, something better than both. She smiled the way you smile when you have arrived somewhere worth arriving, when the road has been long enough and hard enough that the destination means something real. The Meridian project closed 3 months later. Vasquez Capital Group took a controlling interest and brought in Diana's structural engineering team to revise and complete the development. The hotel opened 18 months later, on a bright October morning with a ribbon-cutting ceremony attended by the Atlanta mayor and covered by every major city outlet. It was called the Meridian. Alina kept the name because she liked what it meant, the highest point, the apex. Marco was there in a small blazer he'd picked out himself, eating a hotel breakfast pastry and trying to look like he attended ribbon cuttings every day, which lately he sort of did. Beverly from the shelter was there too, in the front row, crying behind her reading glasses. Clarence Webb stood beside Alina as the mayor said the words into the microphone about community development and transformation and the entrepreneurial spirit of Atlanta. He didn't say anything. He just reached over and squeezed her hand once, and she squeezed back. The newspaper photograph that ran the next day showed Alina Vasquez standing in front of the Meridian, her son beside her, both of them squinting slightly against the October sun. She was 33 years old. She looked, the reporter who filed the accompanying story wrote, like someone who had decided exactly what kind of person she was going to be and had simply gone ahead and become her. That night after Marco was asleep, in his own room, in the house she owned in Decatur, where every windowsill still held a plastic dinosaur, Alina sat on the back porch with a cup of tea and let herself be quiet. She thought about the bus stop bench. She thought about Beverly's face the morning she had left the shelter, the way Beverly had held both of Alina's hands and said nothing, just looked at her for a long moment, transferring something wordless and essential. She thought about her grandfather in Oaxaca, building his house with his own hands, stone by patient stone. She looked at the Atlanta skyline, lit up in the October dark, and she thought, I built something here, something real, something that cannot be taken back. And then she finished her tea, went inside and got ready for tomorrow. Because she was just getting started. They put her out through the service entrance with $3,000 and told her to disappear. She didn't disappear. She built an empire. And I have to ask you something right now because I genuinely want to know. When you picture Alina on that bus stop bench, pregnant, alone, carrying nothing but a duffel bag and someone else's silence, what do you feel? Because I know what I feel. I feel the particular bone-deep anger of watching someone brilliant and good get treated like they are less than nothing by someone who had everything. I feel that. And I think you do too. But here's what gets me, here's what this story is really about. It's not about revenge. Alina never called it revenge. She called it clarity. She looked at what had been done to her and she made a decision. I will become something he cannot ignore. I will not shrink. I will not disappear. I will build. And she built. If this story hit you somewhere real, if Alina's journey made your heart pound or your eyes sting or your fists clench, then I need you to do something for me right now. Smash that like button. Not for me. For every Alina who is sitting on a bus stop bench right now, carrying something heavy, holding onto 3 words in whatever language is their mother tongue. It's not over yet. Drop "not over yet" in the comments if this story moved you. I read every single one. And if you're new here, if the algorithm dropped you into this story, and you stayed until the end, welcome. This channel is where we tell the stories that don't get told. The women who built empires from rubble, the moments when the world briefly does what it's supposed to do, the justice that arrives quietly and completely and brings powerful people to their knees. Subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss a single one. We have more stories coming, stories that will make you angry, stories that will make you believe, stories about ordinary people who made extraordinary choices when the world gave them nothing to work with. You belong here. This community belongs to everyone who has ever been underestimated, overlooked, or handed an envelope through a service entrance and told their story was over. Their story is never over. Neither is yours. See you in the next one.